Why do consumers care? Well, if you think the US-China tech war is a really big deal, it's disconcerting to say the least that America's greatest company is playing for the other side.
You're listening to The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
Welcome to the Amber Mac Show. Coming up, Canada gets its first ever AI minister. Plus, we have the author of a new book that unpacks why making the iPhone in China made the world more vulnerable. And speaking of Apple, the latest on what made President Trump angry at Tim Cook. And we try to explain why Elon Musk's Chatbot goes rogue about white genocide. Jeff, a lot to discuss. First up, I wanted to mention I'm just back from hosting the Click conference where I interviewed Olympian Katie Ledecky, which was super awesome. And while I was away, I noticed that your segment on Mark Zuckerberg's AI Friends is getting a lot of attention online.
Yeah, that's kind of awesome and great that you got to interview Katie there as well. If there's something I think we can all agree on in terms of my segment, it's probably that Mark Zuckerberg is definitely in the main cast of tech villains in our world. So you can check out that full segment on YouTube. But speaking of news, let's get to the tech headlines.
News feed.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has appointed Canada's first ever AI minister, former journalist Evan Solomon. His full title is Minister of AI and Digital Innovation. And as the Globe and Mail reports, Mr. Solomon could face a host of challenges in this role, experts say, including how to increase AI adoption and commercialization, encourage the construction of Canadian-owned and operated data centers, and determining how to regulate AI. So a lot on his plate.
Absolutely. And while I sincerely wish him all the best in his new role, and I hope he can achieve great things, and all those things are important, I'm of the feeling that Canadian cabinets are much, much larger than any similar country in the world and twice as large as the OECD average if you count our 10 secretaries of state. So I'm not sure this is a minister level assignment, really. But that said, I would be very happy to be proven wrong and want to wish Mr. Solomon the best of luck. Looking forward to see what he achieves, because if he can achieve those things, certainly important for Canada and good for all of us. So good luck out there.
Well, especially after we had Sinead on last week's episode where we talked about how AI is a Canadian story, but we've kind of lost our way. I think one of the goals will be to get things back on track. So we will keep an eye on this story and see some announcements coming out of the federal government, hopefully on that front. And sticking with AI, OpenAI has announced it's launching a new safety evaluations hub webpage to share info, including the hallucination rates of its AI models and more. What do you think about this?
I think it's good. I think the more transparency we can get out of these companies, the better. The big issue is that it's kind of self-reporting stuff. So OpenAI itself is doing the tests and choosing what to share. So I'm a little bit skeptical as to how useful that is, given that we've had so many stories of companies like Meta purposely hiding important data that they collect that's supposed to be for our purpose, but it puts them in a bad light, and so they don't release it. So, let's hope they can behave better than that. If they do, then this is a good idea, and it's a step in the right direction regardless.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on something you said, because I was reading on the OpenAI website where they say, by sharing a subset of our safety evaluation results here, we hope this will not only make it easier to understand the safety performance of OpenAI systems over time, and then it goes on to describe a little bit more of what they're doing. But I think the key word that you kind of referred to there is that we're sharing a subset. This is
exactly.
Something that is usually incomplete, and they are potentially not sharing everything. So that is the thing that I think, like you said, really worries me. Again, it's just a select amount of data and for information as well.
Yeah,
and
I would have loved to share a subset of my high school grades to universities when I got in.
Yeah, that's for those of us who understand language. I think that is a key word that they added in there that some lawyer said, put in subset, and some people may just ignore it. But speaking of hiding data, it looks like the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has, as Wired reports, canceled its plans to introduce new rules designed to limit the ability of U.S. data brokers to sell sensitive information about Americans, including financial data, credit history, and social security numbers.
I mean, to use a very technical term, this is bonkers. What in heaven's name? Just in December, the now former director of the CFPB said that these changes were necessary to combat the commercial surveillance practices that, quote, threaten our personal safety and undermine America's national security. He's obviously been replaced. And so the notion that these protections are now unnecessary is verging on impossible to understand, other than recognizing that data brokering is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and now more than ever in Trump's US, money is power. So I suppose that's really where it's coming from, I would have to guess.
Yeah, when I read some of this news from the US, then I look at our news that we would normally be critical of, and then I feel like, oh my goodness, it's not so bad here after all. So, you spoke recently about Trump tariffs relative to Apple. So I'm curious what you think of Trump's declaration during his recent visit to the Middle East that, and I'm quoting here, I had a little problem with Tim Cook yesterday. You're coming in with 500 billion, but now I hear you're building all over India. We're not interested in you building in India.
I mean, it is just beyond the pale to have the president of the United States basically directly ordering a specific private company about how to run their business. It's even more so incredible given that Apple is the most valuable brand in the world and Trump is an economic illiterate. So it's just head shakingly crazy.
It is. And speaking of something else you may not like, I just read in Ars Technica about Netflix's recent announcement that it will show generative AI ads midway through streams starting next year. What do you think of this?
I mean, it's not entirely clear what they're talking about. There weren't a lot of details. I tried to dig this stuff up, but aren't ads bad enough when they don't involve AI? I just cannot imagine how many terrible ads we're going to be subject to. Now, in fairness, Netflix has been doing quite well on its ad subscription tier. And if people would prefer to see ads instead of paying more, then that's their decision. I actually bought a new Apple TV just so I could have the mute button, so I could mute commercials when that happened for sports things. But it certainly makes a lot of sense for Netflix to pursue this. That said, if you look back to 2011, the Netflix non-ad subscription standard plan was $7.99 per month. It's now twice that. So I'm not optimistic about where this is going in terms of people who would prefer to pay to not have ads, because it seems like the sky's the limit, maybe.
Well, I feel like after the past few minutes of news, we should end on something a little more positive. And this is an AI announcement that's pretty cool. It's a startup called Doji that is launching an app to help you virtually try on clothes using a personalized avatar that is created using AI. So this looks really neat.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I think they have launched the app already, but it's invite only. So they're just testing things out, I suppose. But they've also got a great social tie-in where you can share your try-on experience. So your avatar will try on whatever clothes that you want to take a look at, see if you want to buy. And then you can share those photos through social media. So that's kind of cool. I can see how that would be very popular. And while the current model doesn't deal with how clothes fit, it's just sort of how they would look on your avatar in a simpler way, the company also wants to tackle that so that they'll be able to have the clothes fit reflect sort of the physical dimensions of your avatar in ways that you can go, I think that'll be a little too tight on my waist, or a little too tight on my tummy, or whatever it is. So yeah, it seems really fun and a positive way to use this. And people are doing enough online shopping that anything that prevents people from having to send things back all the time, which is just a terrible waste of energy and bad for the environment, anything that can help lessen that, I think is good. So yeah, you go, Doji. Let's see how it works.
Yeah, I think that looks like a really fun app. We'll have to try to get on the invite list and try it out. And I totally agree. I know people who will order one of every different size that potentially will fit them, and then they just send things back, and that becomes kind of like a habit. Yeah. I find it so bizarre, but maybe I'm just not that into fashion. That could be part of it. All right, that's the news for this week. Next up, Jeff is going to talk about Grok's declarations of white genocide on Musk's X platform.
The Other Mac.
By now, you may have come across stories about how Elon Musk's Grok AI, which is integrated into X, has been bringing up the topic of white genocide in South Africa in the middle of inquiries that have absolutely no relation to that subject at all, including in response to a question about a wrestling match, and also somebody asking how many times HBO has changed its streaming service's name, which is, I think, is 3 or 4 now. But given that there are currently over 4.5 million white people counted in South Africa's most recent census, hundreds of thousands more than a quarter century ago, I think we can put aside the notion that there's been anything like a white genocide in that country and instead try to figure out what would compel an AI to claim such a thing. Grok's responses were taken down, but according to a report by CNBC, Grok originally explained, I quote, "It appears I was instructed to address the topic of white genocide in South Africa." However, it later changed its response to similar questions to, quote, "No, I wasn't programmed to give any answers promoting or endorsing harmful ideologies, including anything related to white genocide or similar conspiracies." Okay. Well, now xAI, Musk's company that created Grok, has tried to explain away the problem by saying an unauthorized modification to Grok led to these responses, and that this violated its internal policies and core values, and then it promised to put in place further checks so employees can't modify Grok without review. Now, you may remember that just a couple months ago, Grok was censoring sources criticizing Elon Musk and Donald Trump with respect to spreading misinformation. Do you know what AI's explanation was? That a rogue employee had modified Grok. And so it's happened again, eh? So we've got an AI chatbot that will contradict itself after being accused, while the company that made it insists that they've taken the necessary steps, again, to prevent people in their own company from making these modifications after seemingly failing on that exact task just months ago. Now, it has occurred to me, and to many others, that, Musk was born and lived his childhood in South Africa, and has himself absolutely promoted the idea of white genocide in that country on X. And it seems that President Trump agrees with this notion, having just provided refugee status to welcome in a group of white South Africans within a week or so of this happening. In fact, one of Grok's responses to the matter said, and I quote again, "The likely source of this instruction aligns with Elon Musk's influence, giving his public statements on the matter." Regardless, the real takeaway from this is that the trust that the tech bros are asking us to put in AI is entirely for their own benefit, and that a company that wants to be valued at $120 billion with an entirely digital product can't seem to prevent its own employees from changing its code in malicious ways, or track that they've done it, or when they did it, or who did it, or anything like this, judging by the lack of progress that was made months after Grok's similar Trump-Musk disinformation issues in February. So I guess we'll never officially know how an AI created by a company, controlled by a CEO founder who likes to have direct access to company code, and who is a white South African with extreme right-wing views that include repeated proclamations about one white genocide in South Africa. Yeah, I guess we'll just never know how that AI could have possibly ended up promoting that very same idea. I suppose we'll just have to go back to wondering what the heck is the matter with all those windows in Russia that enemies of the government keep innocently falling out of. Or maybe we should just leave that job to AI. Something tells me that's what Elon and his ilk would prefer. I'm the other Mac. Be careful who you trust out there.
You're listening to The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
Patrick McGee is a former Financial Times Apple reporter and Canadian-born journalist. He just released a brand new book called Apple in China, and Amber got the chance to speak with Patrick about how Apple's dependence on China has made the world a whole lot more vulnerable.
Talking Tech.
Patrick, I was reading about why you decided to write this book, and I read a comment that you shared where you said everything being made in China was the Achilles heel of that company, of course, being Apple. So take me back to that moment.
So in the summer of 2022, I'd been reporting on Apple for the Financial Times for about 3 years. And I was beginning to look like I was drinking the Kool-Aid coming from Cupertino because I got really bullish about their prospects. And now that's fine for a couple of stories. I wrote about how 9 out of 10 American teenagers prefer iPhone. And, the implications of that are when they go off to college, they're probably going to buy AirPods and MacBooks. And I just thought, their sales are going to have a steady accretion over the next few years. But that's not a great place to be as a reporter, right? You don't want to just be like singing the tune that the company you're following is singing. And so I began to ask the opposite question, which is, if this rosy scenario that I'm imagining does not turn out, what will be the reason that prohibits it, right? And so I, for the first time, really started asking questions about where everything and how everything was produced. And, all roads lead through China a lot more than I had understood, even though I, like anybody else, had seen the box or the back of the old iPhones that said they were assembled in China. And I just began to investigate, and I couldn't believe how much I was learning and how much hadn't been written about what I consider now to be, the biggest untold story in tech for the last 25 years.
I also read that you did more than 200 interviews during this process, talking to former executives and engineers. As you were doing that reporting and researching and writing the book, did it really just reinforce what you were initially thinking about this incredible story that needed to be told?
I figured out the contours of the story pretty early and was able to, write a 70-page pitch on what I was going to go find. But then the details that I found, I mean, completely upended certain narratives that I had. And, one thing I would say is when I started the research, I really thought I was going to spend 3 to 4 months diligently going after as many people with Apple experience as I could. And when that inevitably failed, I was going to switch tack and start trailing the story through suppliers like Pegatron and Foxconn and so forth. Plan A never failed. I just knocked it out of the park on how many people from Apple I was able to speak to. And the 200 figure, that's only counting the Apple people. I also spoke with suppliers and such. But it almost underrepresents the sourcing I was able to get, because it's not the number, it's the caliber of role that these people held, either in seniority or how like deep in the weeds on the ground they were in China.
So I would assume, as someone who has covered the tech industry for 2 decades, that people were a little bit reluctant to speak because, having done press events where Apple is managing everything, they have pretty tight control over who says what. So did you have that same experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my hit rate in terms of who responds when I reach out is very low, but I reached out to thousands of people. So even with a low hit rate, it was a numbers game. And that's how I was able to speak to enough people. And then once you form relationships with people, you'd say, who are the top 5 people that you could either, reach out to on my behalf or confidentially reach out to and have them speak to me. So there was that. The other thing is that a lot of people in Apple, and it's not just former employees, by the way, it's current ones as well. A lot of people are unhappy with how much they've consolidated into China and the strategy that took them there. I mean, the number of people that would have made those decisions are just the higher echelons, right? But the engineers and even the executives that were going over to China, they didn't make that call and they were uncomfortable with that call. And I wanted to tell the stories of the people who thought there could have been a different path and they were uncomfortable about the consolidation into China. So, people weren't just disgruntled employees or anything. These are people that had the time of their life working for Apple, but the decisions to be in China were above their pay grade, and they were happy to tell their story because they think change is needed at the company.
Of course, we're going to talk more about China, but I also want to talk for a second about India, because we do hear this story over and over again that Apple is starting more and more to actually assemble products in India. So what are some of the stats there?
So Apple wants you to talk about it more and more. And the reason they want to is because China knows that it's not really a true story. So there's no risk there. But if you think it's a true story, then it's fantastic for Apple's PR, and it certainly avoids the tariffs. But to put it simplistic a bit, if there's 1,000 steps to making an iPhone and the final one is now being done in India, hooray, you've avoided tariffs. It's now made in India. Have you de-risked your supply chain whatsoever? Absolutely not. So Amber, if you're able to buy an iPhone next year and the box says made in India, it will be no less no less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than any other iPhone you've ever purchased.
So this is such a unique time to be putting out this book because presumably you would not have known a couple of years ago what was going on in terms of the tariffs that we're seeing today. I'm always a bit reluctant to talk about tariffs because it is sort of this moving situation that is constantly evolving. But I think it's important to talk a little bit about this situation with the tariff wars that we are faced with today. So how is that impacting what's happening?
Well, so Apple began making iPhones in India in 2017, and that was also about tariffs. It wasn't about Trump's tariffs, it was about Narendra Modi's tariffs. So India was building a middle class, growing 8% a year, and Apple, looking geographically for where's our next growth region, really centered on this country of a billion plus people with a growing middle class. Problem was Modi, or New Delhi, you could say, put something like 22% tariffs on smartphones coming from China. So there was a real push within India to have phones made in India. And so Apple began shifting then. Now, the more recent sort of acceleration, if you will, of the assembly is less about Modi's tariffs and more about Trump's tariffs. So if Trump is putting, or at least threatening, 125%, 145% tariffs on China, then of course what you want to do is sort of reroute the shipments so that they're coming from India. Now, you can't sort of just reroute them. You sort of can't have India as a pit stop, but India is sort of becoming the closest thing to that, where basically the sub-assembly and all the components and everything are really all going through China, but then they're going to India for sort of one final step where the sub-assemblies are put together and then put in a box that says made in India. So I think there's far less going on, or far less that meets the eye in India than Apple would like you to believe. But if they're to move wholesale from China, we're talking about something that isn't made, an announcement for next year. We're talking about a 15 to 20-year effort with totally unpredictable consequences as to how Beijing would react, how Chinese consumers react, and with no certainty or guarantee that it would even work out. I mean, China is just leagues ahead of anybody else when it comes to the depth and breadth of of advanced electronics industry. And I wish I was more optimistic about India, but I'm really not. And I don't think Apple's actually making gargantuan investments despite their statements to the contrary.
What kind of disruption is this causing within Apple? And especially if we think about Tim Cook, who's had really, I think, a very flattering persona out there in the public. What is this doing to Apple and their image?
Well, amongst Tim Cook's goals, and among Tim Cook's attributes is he's really a statesman as much as he is a CEO. And that's because Apple is so big that the actions that it takes in other countries literally have geopolitical consequences. That's not the case for most other corporate CEOs. And so he's being put in a role here where he is sort of having to please and placate both Xi Jinping in China as well as Donald Trump in Washington. And what's really interesting is that insofar as Apple is a bargaining chip between those superpowers, it's Beijing's bargaining chip, not Washington's. And that's an astonishing state of affairs. I mean, I call Apple the world's greatest company, but in terms of who has the leverage over its day-to-day operations, it's inarguably Beijing, not Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I can use President Trump's language, China holds the cards here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why should the average consumer care about this story?
Great question. I think they should care because, and this is the thesis of the book. So sorry, I guess I have to back up just a little bit. The gist of my argument, it's really not even an argument so much as a demonstration of what happened over the last 30 years, is that in the 1980s, when you moved from a company like IBM outsourcing to a company like SCI or Selectron, and of course later Foxconn, there's a technology transfer that takes place where IBM would have to teach these contract manufacturers how to build something. And at the time, it wasn't a big deal because it was just a company-to-company transaction, a company-to-company transition. Once China joins the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Western corporations are all engendering this sort of technology transfer, it becomes country to country, where our industry is actually sort of being hollowed out, and we're deindustrializing, and we're relying on China to make up for that and to sort of come up with the shop floor innovations. Now, that's sort of all right insofar as China is an ally and we're all going to inculcate the world's biggest democracy, and small L liberal values are going to build a middle class in China, and then you're going to sort of overthrow the communist power. I mean, that was sort of the American consensus in the late 1990s, early 2000s. You might remember something like the Golden Arches theory of diplomacy. This is Thomas Friedman saying, no two countries that have McDonald's have ever gone to war. Well, things really take a different turn when Xi Jinping takes office in late 2012, basically sees Apple as an exploitative power that is giving back to the country. And Apple suddenly has to sort of learn to speak the local language and convince Beijing of all the things that it is doing for the Chinese supply chain. And so Apple internally hire senior people to actually live in China for the first time between 2013 and 2014. These people call themselves the Gang of Eight. They're sort of running everything that's happening in China, and they're playing the eyes and ears of Cupertino, if you will, on the ground in China. And what they realize is that Apple is investing a whopping $55 billion a year in China. That doesn't even include the cost of components, so-called bill of materials within an iPhone. This is just the labor cost of having up to 3 million people in your supply chain just working on Apple products. This is the training cost of those workers, their wages, billions of dollars worth in machinery that Apple would install in suppliers' factories to allow them to work on products at a scale, at a quality, at a quantity that they couldn't do without Apple. And so Apple begins to realize, oh, there's a really big political play here where we can convince Beijing we are giving back. We might not have any joint ventures in the country, which is the thing Beijing has been pushing for decades, but we are having an enormous impact on quote unquote indigenous innovation in China. And that's sort of the essence of the narrative. So why do consumers care? Well, if you think the US-China tech war is a really big deal, it's disconcerting to say the least that America's greatest company is playing for the other side.
Well, there's a lot to unpack just in that statement because
400 pages worth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating too. I mean, as you were writing this book and as you look at what's happening today in terms of essentially this war, if I can call it that, do you think there's any good solution to all of this?
So if there was a quick and easy solution, or even a long-term obvious solution, my book wouldn't be very compelling, because the point of the book is to point out that Apple is really stuck here. So if there was some easy solution, then I wouldn't have such a stark conclusion. Nevertheless, it's a really fair question, and I would absolutely want to see Apple making enormous investments in India, because India is an ally. It would build resilience in their supply chain. And if you understand the technology transfer embedded or engendered in the way Apple operates, then it would actually do a lot for India. I'm not even sure New Delhi understands just what an asset it is to have Apple production in the country. The thing that people don't get about Apple is they are not just relying on component makers to sort of continually upgrade and they use the newest components and build the next iPhone. They are sending literal plane loads of engineers from California into hundreds of factories across China, and this could be India, of course, and they are inventing the processes, the manufacturing behind the next parts and components. And so that's where the investments are so significant. And so if you are disconcerted by the idea that China has become an absolutely electronics manufacturing juggernaut, well, then you should support the idea that they should be doing this in a more allied country like India. Now, the Republican fantasy is that you would do this in America, and we can get into why that's really just a fantasy. I mean, America doesn't have the density of population, the dynamism of the population, and certainly doesn't have the wages, the determined work ethic, any number of things. India is the only country that at least has the potential, because there's more than 1 billion people there. I'm still pretty bearish that it can happen, but with enough investment and understanding of what I call the Apple squeeze, which is we're not going to pay you much, but you're going to learn a hell of a lot from us. If that were taking place more in India and less in China, that would be great. But to sort of preempt your next question, because it's going to be the obvious thing, oh gosh, now I'm losing my train of thought here. It would be, well, what would Beijing do if Apple is to start doing this in India? And of course, Beijing has, no reason to want to lose any of this manufacturing. So the more real depth and breadth of manufacturing that Apple moves to America, if you want to say, to Mexico, to India, the more that Beijing could really exercise some of its power. maybe just in the basic sense of raw materials stop arriving at the factory on time. There's roadblocks. Apple's dealt with this stuff in the past, by the way. Maybe electricity at certain key factories goes out for a few hours, right? They can just do a lot to sort of send a message that we're not happy with whatever it is you just announced in, your latest earnings about moving to India. So in other words, my sort of ideal scenario is politically extremely problematic. So you probably need Beijing at the negotiating table here. But going back to quote you, quoting Trump, Beijing has the cards here, not Apple, and certainly not the US. And so it's a bit of a quagmire, and it's a quagmire of their own making to some degree.
Absolutely. And if you think about the past couple of years or a few years, really, and you think about the future, I wonder if this is going to be a situation where it is such a massive priority and distraction that it impacts innovation at Apple.
I mean, I would almost say I hope it impacts innovation. Like what I mean by that is, most journalists covering Apple, product reviewers, whatever, they think the next big thing after the iPhone is what Apple should be focused on. And I think absolutely not. If Tim Cook were to retire tomorrow and the new CEO came on board, that person's biggest project is to build resiliency into the supply chain and de-risk from China, far more than making sure the iPhone 20 in a few years down the road has, 5 cameras instead of 3 and, double the memory or whatever. I mean, I just think this is existential. New product features are nice. They're icing on the cake. But the cake is in China. Probably the metaphor doesn't go over that well. But I just think it's so much more consequential that they can build their products and not be so dependent on China than to say that the next product is great. And the other reason why the consumer should care. Jon Stewart had a show on Apple TV Plus. Well, what happened to it? He wanted to do an episode on China. Executive said, no thanks. And he gave them the middle finger and he went back to the Daily Show. So the more that Apple is moving into services, the more it really matters. I mean, you're not going to have a cyber thriller on Apple TV Plus where the Chinese person ends up being the villain. I mean, it's just politically taboo. It's never going to happen. And I don't know that we want to live in a society where we're facing those kinds of restrictions. And so as Apple pushes more into services and content and answering your queries with AI, I mean, is Siri ever going to tell you what happened in Tiananmen Square? I don't think so.
Nor will DeepSeek.
Exactly, but ChatGPT will, it absolutely will. And so the China problem, the China dependency actually does have a material impact on Apple's ambitions in artificial intelligence. Even if you're in the US or Canada, that doesn't matter. If Apple is sort of on the record through Siri describing that communist Beijing is an authoritarian power or something, that is a big no-no. So they will give you that answer, but it is distinctly not Siri giving you that answer, right? They're outsourcing that to either ChatGPT or to Google, but it's a big no-no for Apple to answer that question or any number of questions directly.
So you've been covering Apple for a while, and obviously in writing this book all about Apple in China, you, of course, would see things and know things that maybe the rest of us aren't exposed to. And I want to talk specifically about Tim Cook. Do you think he's ready for this challenge?
So let me say something nice about Tim Cook before I take it in an opposite direction. When in 2022, Apple became worth a $3 trillion company, and that was the first time that had ever happened, the value of Apple on average since 2011 when he took over had risen by $700 million per day. I mean, that is such a mind-bogglingly large increase that I thought I had the math wrong and I had to do it 6 ways to Sunday. And then people still thought it was wrong on social media. They did their math their own way and they realized I was right. We don't know as humans, like just how big a billion is, how big a trillion is. I mean, the numbers that Apple does, shipments in, the money it makes, and so forth, it's just incomprehensibly large. I remember talking to an Apple engineer who was trying to teach his kid this, and he said, if you were just to count 1 per second all the way up to a billion, it would take you 32 years. And Apple rakes in $1 billion of revenue per day. I mean, it's really hard to get your mind over just how large and successful this company is. So I will give Tim Cook credit that if you're looking at this from a shareholder perspective, a sort of shareholder first capitalist perspective, Tim Cook is something like a demigod, right? However, he's also the person most responsible for wedding Apple's fortunes to China. And insofar as I think there needs to be a radical untying of that knot or a retying of the knot so that you've got 2 knots, a bifurcated supply chain, one in India with some other nations involved and one in China, I don't think you can have the CEO who's wedded to the current strategy pulling that off. It's a 15-year effort if it can be done at all. I think you need someone 15 years younger than Tim Cook to take that on. So I would effectively be calling for Tim Cook's ouster, but with a golden parachute. Give the guy another $1 billion and a fancy plaque, but someone else needs to come in and see the strategy to the finish line.
It feels to me that Apple is almost untouchable in terms of its persona, right? You know, you see all of these other tech companies that are constantly under the microscope and a lot of attention being paid to them. When I ask you the question about the impact on consumers, I'd also be curious, do you think that consumers will read your book, start to learn more information about Apple's relationship with China, and potentially cause any type of backlash, knowing that I'm not saying Apple people are cult-like because I use Apple products, but they certainly have influence?
I think cult-like is fair, and I might even say I'm in that cult. I mean, I wrote this book, and I'm speaking to you on a MacBook Pro. I have different headphones in, but I own AirPods and Apple Watch and all that. In fact, people find it really funny, but I wrote the entire book in the Notes app, which maybe it's the first book ever written in the Notes app. I don't know, underrated app. End-to-end encrypted. I mean, there's all sorts of great attributes about that app. So I'm not anti-Apple, and my message certainly is not that you need to cut off Apple. I could absolutely see someone coming to that conclusion, but I'm not an activist in any sense. I'm not sort of trying to cause, consumer backlash against Apple whatsoever. And I'm sure, based on the title of the company of the book, particularly the subtitle, there will be a perception that maybe the book is anti-Apple. And I think, in a sense, you'll be in for a bit of a rude awakening, because the first chapters in particular are all about the genius moves that Apple did to really come out of the 1996 crisis, bringing back Steve Jobs and engineering the greatest corporate turnaround ever. And even if the persons aren't always named, but many of them are, I mean, you're rooting for Apple because it's all these geniuses that they've hired that are making all these moves. So it's sort of like a pro rah go Apple book until they sleepwalk into this geopolitical crisis and they sort of realize, oh, we're in way over our head in China. Nobody's senior living in the country in 2012, and they need to radically change that. But that was the moment where, instead of deciding, how can we placate Beijing and sort of be on their side and make sure that there are not obstacles to us producing and selling products here, I think they should have not given so much money to shareholders through buybacks and dividends. I think they should have been building supply chain resiliency. And had they been doing that the last 12, 13 years, I think they'd be in a far better position than they are right now. So Apple's financially the most successful company ever. I think geopolitically, they're in a very precarious situation.
Absolutely. Well, I have so many more questions for you, but I feel like people should definitely just read the book and learn on their own about the situation. And, again, I think a lot of people maybe are just totally unaware of the challenges that are ahead for Apple. So just remind people where they can get the book, the title, when it's available.
So, I mean, your Canadian audience can I'm hoping it becomes a Heather's pick, right? It's certainly at Indigo. It's going to be, I imagine, at all the Canadian shops. In the US, it's definitely at Barnes & Noble. It's on Amazon. It's on Amazon.ca, Target. I think you can basically buy it wherever good books are sold. I'll say the audiobook version is narrated by Fred Sanders. I sort of hand-selected him. He's my favorite narrator, and he does an excellent job. So I should be no problem actually finding the book. And I think if you just read the opening paragraph, I mean, I try to hook you right away. There's no sort of like, here's how I got interested in Apple or anything. It just, you're in the middle of a narrative right away. And then it's just like really fast paced, even though I take you through 3 decades. And I take you to places that you just don't know anything. I mean, you might know Apple really well. I bet you have no idea that the Tangerine Blueberry iMacs were being made in the Czech Republic, in Wales, in Mexicali. You probably don't know that the first iPods were made in Taiwan, not China. You probably don't know what the sewing machine repair shop is, which is an entire chapter. You probably have never heard of the yellow cows. That's my favorite chapter of the book. I mean, the amount of new material in this book is tremendous. And it's not because I'm brilliant. It's because I took an approach to looking at their manufacturing, looking at the geopolitics, and talking to some of the smartest people who have ever worked at Apple. And they were telling me their narratives and had just never talked to journalists before. My job was just to sort of actually, in a certain sense, do what Apple does in China, just pull it all together and package it, right? But all the sort of hard work was really being done by the people who live this narrative. I just had to tell their stories.
Well, a reminder to people, the book is called Apple in China by Patrick McGee. Patrick, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Patrick and Amber. Coming up next, and sticking with the topic of nation building, we tell you why you should consider hosting your website closer to home.
The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.
Emil Falcon is the founder and CEO of Web Hosting Canada, WHC, which is a Montreal-based cloud provider. The WHC team supports 70,000 Canadian businesses that trust WHC with nearly 500,000 websites, domains, and emails. Amber spoke with Emil recently about why you should choose a hosting company that is safer, greener, and yes, more Canadian.
Getting in gear.
Emil, thank you so much for joining me. I really wanted to start with this question. What should Canadians know about hosting their website and their email within Canada?
Well, first off, thank you for having me, Amber. Great to be on the show. Happy to be contributing to a conversation about what it would take to make and help Canadians succeed online and help Canadians choose Canadian solutions and Canadian providers for some of the services that they're using on a day-to-day. So, good question. What does it mean to have to be hosted and to have your email, your website in Canada, and how can you make that happen as a either an individual or small business that has an online presence? A lot of different elements, but primarily I would say, and as simply put as we can, is choosing a Canadian provider that will actually host your data in Canada. So, what makes up a digital infrastructure, what makes up a website are primarily three things. And I'm sure that if you've been in the tech world for ages, so we're talking about network, we're talking about compute, and we're talking about data. That data needs to live somewhere, regardless of how you want to think about your cloud or how you want to think about the technology that delivers that content. Your data ultimately lives somewhere. It's in a place. For Canadians doing business online, more often than not, and sometimes without them even realizing, they're using American providers, which would have been fine and dandy a few years ago, despite there also being many legal implications of doing that. But in today's day and age, with everything we're seeing around tariffs, everything we're seeing around just national sovereignty, but even data sovereignty, it becomes more and more important to have your data close and to support businesses that are doing and operating within Canada. So as far as websites are concerned, it's all about choosing a provider that will actually house your data on Canadian soil, in Canadian data centers, that will power its business through Canadian locations, that will ideally register and manage domain names through their Canadian infrastructure, and that will hire Canadians to help and operate that business. So this is where I think a business like WHC, Canadian founded and operated since 2003, can help. It can help you build a website out here in Canada, host it using a variety of different software, including WordPress and other open source content management systems right here in Canada, and help support you with all of the tooling and initiatives and services that you might need to make that website a success. And what's nice about being able to have that full autonomy through a website, as opposed to, let's say, a social media platform like Facebook, Instagram, video, YouTube, where you obviously also do a lot of publications. That's probably your core, right? Where when you think of where is it that you're going to get seen, most of it is across your social media platforms. But what I love about being able to publish and update and use websites is really that you have full control. You can choose to do whatever you want. It's really a reflection of sort of the time, the energy, and sort of the creative part of how you want to display that brand, how you want to display that organization or your personal project. Great. But what goes in behind the scenes? And so this is where I brought up, there behind the scenes, there's so many moving parts. There's a .com domain, there's a .ca domain, there is a hosting account. So, ambermac.com is, with that. And this is, I'm not doing this to call you out on it. I'm doing this to kind of just bring to the attention how we're making everyday choices that in 2025, we might want to reconsider. Ambermac.com, for example, being registered with an American provider. Ambermac.ca, registered in Canada with a Canadian provider, redirecting to the American version. The .com is hosted in the US with an American provider, an American CDN on an IP address shared by 500 plus other websites, also likely in the US. Content appears to be served yet by another provider, also American-based. I'm not going to call out on any specific brands, but just to give a sense, that the amount of different providers sort of involved in that chain of services needed to ultimately render or service a website such as ambermac.com. The DNS services are hosted through a subsidiary of the American providers that are actually based in Germany. And the website itself hosted through an open source platform, WordPress, which I congratulate you on. I think open source is a great initiative and a great way to encourage creators and encourage and use software that you're not tied into using with this particular provider. It's running a slightly outdated version, but that's okay. That's WordPress 6.8 having just come out not too long ago. These are normal everyday things that users, website users will power their websites through and update them regularly. So some of the joys of having your website is keeping it up to date. So just kind of wanted to bring it back to just highlight some of those elements that go into the websites that we use, the service providers that we use, and how while it's not maybe the natural reflex to sort of think about where those different pieces live, there is an option. There is an option out there to have them live with the Canadian provider and to bring them in to a Canadian provider, such as WHC, but there's so many others out there as well that can do what we do.
Okay, so first of all, I love this because I think this is just a perfect example. And I think when people are watching or listening, they may be thinking about their own website and may not even realize sort of the complex history of where they're hosted, because maybe like me, it was many, many years ago and you just haven't revisited it. So just one or two more questions for you in terms of people who want to make that switch, myself included. So what is involved in actually making that switch so you do actually choose someone like WHC to host your website right here in Canada?
Right. So the answer I would give you was probably applies to, I would say, 80% of the people out there. Obviously, a website can be something very simple, it can be something extremely complex. Where you've built your website or how you've built your website plays a part. But I would say for 80% of the people listening to this podcast and possibly, ambermac.com included, this migration or this move would be simple in that you choose a service provider, you make sure they're trustworthy and they're capable, and then their team actually does that transfer or provides you with self-serve tools that makes it easy for you to do yourself. In the case of WHC, it's literally as simple as ordering the service you need, transferring the domain over, and the website component is taken on by our team of experts who do the migration for you, often in a matter of an hour or two. Obviously, again, depends on the complexity of the website. Maybe a website of the magnitude of ambermac.com, a lot more content there to move over. But the process is generally straightforward, especially for using a type of website like one powered by software like WordPress, open source software, where we have actually access to the data. This type of move is straightforward. So for those of you for some of the listeners out there that are concerned about, I don't have the time, I don't have the mental capacity to worry about something like moving a website over, we can reassure them by saying it's actually easier than you might think. And if it's not feasible or if it's not doable, we'll let you know straight off the bat, so you don't have to start going in circles for nothing.
Okay, so first of all, this is one of the best interviews I've ever done because I love that you just, you came with the receipts, as the kids say, and there's lots of meat here to talk about in terms of making that switch, which I am absolutely going to do because you've just walked me through how easy that is. But one final question for you. Can you just talk for a second about a couple of other reasons that you may want to do this, but I'd also love to know about some of the costs involved, because I'm sure for small business owners, which is a lot of our audience, they may be thinking, okay, well, sometimes it's more expensive to choose Canadian tech providers. So walk us through that last piece, like, again, reinforce why this makes sense and what's the cost of doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, why this makes sense, there are multiple reasons. We like to think at WHC that we are the one of the best service providers to cater to your website's needs. So it would make sense just because you're going to get a best-in-class experience at just like an insane value point. So you're probably I invite you to check out WHC.ca to kind of see the services available and the price points. But in terms of why you would want to switch over to a Canadian service provider, in addition to the obvious context of today, being tariffs, moving away from American service providers, reinvesting in the Canadian economy, supporting a Canadian service provider. There's also factors like the environment. In Canada, we have one of these rare benefits. We're blessed to be able to operate on a grid that is powered by hydroelectrical power, pretty much coast to coast. So we actually operate most of our data centers through 100% hydroelectric electricity. And that means that your website isn't contributing to global warming, at least not in any of the ways that some of those American data centers powered by coal or fossil fuels are. We also use technology that leverages water cooling as opposed to air conditioning. So just overall, the general power usage from the infrastructure that powers your websites and your digital infrastructure, including domains and servers, is much less. And again, you're supporting a Canadian team that hires Canadian workers, that operates Canadian infrastructure, all while keeping your data protected by Canadian law. And that is actually a very significant point, because unfortunately, when you host your data in the US, or even you host your data with a US provider, even if that data resides in Canada, you're actually subject to the US Cloud Act, which gives the American government very long reach into being able to look at, seize, and manipulate your data sort of as they please. Obviously, there's some legal oversight. It's just in today's environment, political environment, there's so much uncertainty with what's going on in the US that this has become a very scary thing, especially for businesses that have interests that are also of interest to the American government. So that's just one of the many reasons that you would want to go with get your data hosted in Canada, or use a provider where that keeps your digital assets out in Canada.
I love this. I will make sure that my team calls your team and we get this sorted right away. And I really wanted to thank you so much for joining me today on the Amber Mac Show and walking me through all these details. Super important, again, especially for all the entrepreneurs and small business owners in Canada who do want to choose Canadian and maybe didn't have a chance to think about this aspect of their business. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Emil and Amber. That's it for today's episode of the Amber Mac Show.
Coming up later this month, we talk to one of the people who helped turn the Tragically Hip into an iconic Canadian band. Please keep sending us ideas for segments and guests to follow. Thanks so much for tuning in, and have a great week.
The Amber Mac Show on Canada Talks, Sirius XM 167.